You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
Okay, so this is part 3 of the Gilded Age. What we're going to do is we're going to take a look at labor. And we're going to try to appreciate the difference between skilled and unskilled labor. The industrial and the political elites of the United States are going to take hold of this country, and they're going to organize the greatest march of economic growth in human history. And remember, after the Civil War, Wall Street will take over this country and create an economic system that is just going to be awesome. It's a continental system. And they're going to do it with the aid of and at the expense of every conceivable labor force that they can get a hold of. Black labor, white labor, Chinese labor, European immigrant labor, Mexican labor, Native American labor, female labor, child labor. And they're going to reward them differently by their race, by their gender, by their national origin, by their age, and by their social class. And this march of economic growth transformed existing social relations, and it introduced radical changes in production and occupational structures. Now, let's take a look at the difference between skilled and unskilled labor. Now, as the work process mechanizes, workers lose control over the work process. Now industry can add unskilled human labor, where previously skilled labor made the whole process. Now let's understand this. Individuals now take on one part of the process. This is why women and children become expendable in this era. So the result for the worker is that the spiritual dimension of a product is lost. There is no real pride in creating a whole finished product. And this is known as alienation of the worker from the production process. But it also means that the worker is no longer an owner of his own tools or the machines to create the product. It used to mean that workers owned their own tools and made a finished product. But now the worker is easily replaceable. This made it difficult for the workers to combine their energies so as to protect their interests. There were always other workers to replace them. So the loss of skills also meant the loss of organizing ability. Mechanization also means work is regulated by time. So hours of the working day become a measure of labor, and hours regulation becomes a goal of reformers. Now, let's understand certain things. Let's understand something, what is known as uncertainty. Uncertainty. Uncertainty is a basic aspect of life. Uncertainty is socially distributed. Uncertainty can increase, it can be aggravated, or uncertainty can be decreased, or it can be mitigated, depending on your class background, depending on your social background, depending on your economic background. It's also dependent on the region that you live in, your age, most importantly, your gender, and your race. So this kind of uncertainty involves whether one will work or whether one is going to be unemployed. So there is a serious difference here that we need to appreciate. The owner of the tools has more control over work and income than one who only has labor to produce a product. So you'll be reading in the textbook about how capitalists do certain things in the Gilded Age to control their level of uncertainty. Capitalists engage in what is known as horizontal integration, or they engage in what is known as vertical integration. What they do is they form pools, they form trusts, they form holding companies, and they use the federal government to support their business activities by securing subsidies, by securing protective tariffs, by ensuring that the federal government opens up lands by creating land acts for them to get access to resources, And most importantly, by ensuring that the federal government finds them workers, hence immigration policies. And then ensuring that the U.S. military removes native peoples so that capitalists can gain access to the lands in the West. And then they benefit from the federal government investing in research and development through the universities. Now, if workers challenge capitalist power, the state and the federal government responds by sending militias to quell workers' discontent. And then ultimately what capitalists do is they experiment in labor relations by creating what is known as the company town. And in essence, through a company town, capitalists not only become employers, but landlords. The company owns everything in the town: the stores, the churches, the houses, the newspapers, the telegraph services, the public library. This is how capitalists control their level of uncertainty in a dog-eat-dog market known as the market system. Workers then reduce their uncertainty by suffering calmly and going to church on Sundays and asking the Lord for assistance. Well, not necessarily that way. What workers do is they organize into unions. Workers will set up producer and consumer cooperatives. Now, during the Gilded Age, immigrant workers are going to fight for an 8-hour day. Can you imagine? They're going to argue for public lands for settlers. They're going to insist on currency reform. They will want to abolish the contract prison labor system. They will encourage the ending of child labor. They will demand equal pay for men and women. They will demand the establishment of a labor bureau to monitor working conditions, because when you go into work, you could lose a finger, you could lose a hand, you could lose an arm, you could lose your life, and nothing would happen. And most importantly, they will insist that the government take over the ownership of the railroads and the telegraph system, part of the public good. And they will insist that the rich pay their way too, through a graduated income tax. And this is what they will begin to demand during the Gilded Age. Workers will create fraternal associations, or what are known as mutual benefit societies, mutualistas in the Mexican communities. And what these mutual benefit societies are all about is about providing life insurance, sickness benefits, funeral expenses for a small monthly or a yearly fee. So immigrant workers and those who built America are going to get involved in city politics as a way to secure employment and as a way to get urban services. Because back then, cities were just built, housing was just built haphazardly, and there was no such thing as parks and recreation. There was no such thing as indoor plumbing. So they will insist on bathhouses. They will insist that perhaps parks should be developed so that the children can play in the parks rather than in the streets. And they will want paved streets. This is what the immigrant coming to America will insist on. Now, let's take a look at unionization efforts, of how labor is going to organize and try to decrease their level of uncertainty. As I shared with you, capitalists organized by creating trusts, pools, combining and monopolizing industries. Workers will organize into unions. Now, there were two important unions during the Gilded Age that impacted immigrant lives. Now, the first one are the Knights of Labor. Now, the Knights of Labor, officially it was known as the Noble and Holy Order of the Knights of Labor. It was one of the largest and most important American labor organizations of the 1880s. It's its most important leader was Terence Powderly. Now, the Knights promoted the social and the cultural uplift of the working man. It rejected socialism and radicalism. It demanded an 8-hour day, and it promoted the producer's ethic of republicanism. In some cases, it acted as a labor union. It negotiated with employers. But the Knights of Labor was never well organized, and after a rapid expansion in the mid-1880s, it suddenly lost its new members and became a small operation again. But the Knights of Labor was very important because its primary demand was for an 8-hour day. And they also called for legislation to end child and labor conflict. They were eager supporters of cooperatives. Under the leadership of the Knights of Labor, a demonstration and unrest took place on Tuesday, May 4th, 1886, at the Haymarket Square in Chicago. When we take a look at the Haymarket Affair, the Haymarket, what is going to be known as the Haymarket Riot, the Haymarket Affair, common laborers, artisans, merchants, and immigrants called for a rally following an incident in which police opened fire and killed 4 workers at the Mccormick Harvesting Machine Company plant. And during the course of a 3-day general strike in Chicago, police moved in to disperse the event and opened fire on the unarmed crowd. Let's go to a film clip from a documentary that helps us appreciate the Haymarket Affair.
What happened May 3rd at the McCormick Reaper Works got the anarchists involved in another labor dispute and ignited the most sensational labor incident of the 19th century. Cyrus Hall McCormick, the Reaper King, had died in 1884. A floral reaper adorned his casket. His last words were work, work, work. His son mechanized the plant. Blades that used to be forged by hand were now forged by steam hammer. This threatened the skilled iron workers. In May 1886, they'd been on strike for months. McCormick hired scabs to take their place.
The Mccormick Strike was over a long-standing dispute that had begun before the 8-hour day had begun, that turned on the attempt of McCormick to mechanize the whole process of iron molding, and thereby to get rid of one of the strongest unionized forces, the Iron Molders Union. And these were largely Irish. And so there was a very bitter struggle that was going on at that time. Some of the Bohemian lumber shovers and other socialists and anarchists had gone up there in solidarity with the McCormick workers. August Spies had made a very militant speech.
When the whistle blew to end the shift on May 3rd, locked out strikers attacked the scabs as they left the plant. Police rushed in to protect the scabs. They killed 2 of the striking workers.
Spies witnessed this from behind a boxcar. He saw it. And he ran back to his office on Wells Street, and he wrote a protest. And he left it on the desk and said, I want this circulated the next morning. And he told them to put a banner on it. Well, to his great dismay, the banner that somebody put on it was revenge, which was the last thing that should have been put on it, because he didn't mean it to be that kind of thing.
A second circular called for a rally the next evening at Haymarket Square. Haymarket Square was an open-air market by day. By nightfall on May 4th, the pushcarts were gone. Chicago's popular mayor Carter Harrison was there and made certain the crowd saw him. It would ensure order.
It was a fairly peaceful rally. I mean, the anarchists were saying things that they always said, death to the owner class, revolution. Mayor Harrison rode up and everybody yelled, huzzah, huzzah, Mayor Harrison, and he took his hat off and he waved it to people. And it was a little campaign thing. And he stayed at the back, and the police captain, Captain Bonnefeld, came up and said, what should we do with this rabble, sir? And he said, basically, let them speak. They've said many worse things than they're saying tonight. And there's no one here. And he said, I'm going to go home. And he goes home.
Captain Bonfield dismissed most of his men, not all. The last speaker, Samuel Fielden, remembered the men shot at the McCormick Works. The law is framed for your enslavers, he said. Throttle it, kill it, do everything you can to impede its progress. Bonfield considered this inflammatory. He ordered the police to march. Fielden was winding down. He that has to obey the will of another is a slave. Can we do anything except by the strong arm of resistance? War has been declared on us. People have been shot. Defend yourselves. No one noticed the man lurking in the shadows. Any animal will resist when stepped upon. Are men less than snails or worms? In the name of the state of Illinois, I command you to disperse, the police captain said. But we are peaceable, Fielden protested.
Now, what's going to happen is an unknown person is going to throw a dynamite bomb at the police as the police were dispersing a public meeting. The bomb and the resulting police riot left at least a dozen people dead, including one policeman. This event became known worldwide as the Haymarket Affair. A sensational show trial ensued in which 8 defendants were openly tried for their political beliefs and not necessarily for any involvement in the bombing. Now let's return to the documentary and let's appreciate what happened.
Seven policemen were killed, mostly by friendly fire. The Chicago Times called the workers ragtag and bobtailed cutthroats of Beelzebub from the Rhine, the Danube, the Vistula, and the Elbe. Labor's largest paper called them wild beasts. The respected Albany Law Review called them long-haired, wild-eyed, bad-smelling, atheistic, reckless foreign wretches.
It was front-page news around the world. Remember, Chicago is the world's window into the future. People from around the world really saw it as what city life was going to be like for them, perhaps 10 or 20 years down the road. And when you got into the labor violence, what appeared to be proletarian riots, it was very frightening to people in many places around the world.
Throughout the nation, Americans were almost unanimous in favor of the utmost repression of the anarchists. There was a belief that American civic institutions were being threatened to their core. Foreign-born workers under the leadership of anarchists were seen to be a threat of the first order.
The very next day, martial law was declared in Chicago.
A law is passed
saying that no more than 2 people can be standing on a street corner to talk. If there's 3, you can arrest them. And homes are entered without search warrants. All the union newspapers are closed down. Hundreds, literally hundreds of labor leaders are put in the different city jails.
After Haymarket, the city went crazy. This is a real red hunt, and it's the first American red hunt. They know that everyone they're rounding up is not an anarchist. They're rounding up labor agitators. They're out to crush the labor movement, which is the threat here, more than the anarchists. They can handle them. They can hang them and shoot them. In many ways, this is, for them, an opportunity. They can paint them with the brush of anarchism and go after them like that.
They didn't belong to the human race, poet Carl Sandburg, a child at the time, would recall. They seemed more like slimy animals who prowl, sneak, and kill in the dark. I didn't hear anyone in our town who didn't so believe. 8 were charged with murder and conspiracy. They included Albert Parsons, who had fled to Wisconsin, but returned.
Here's a man who's rather naive, don't you think? He sits up there in Wisconsin and he says, well, this is America, and the justice system will prove me to be right. And so I'll come down, I'll talk about anarchism, I'll explain that I was 5 blocks away in a tavern with my wife, and the jury will, let me go.
Judge Joseph E. Gary presided over the trial.
Well, there was such fury about the case that there was no effort made to find a fair jury. The bailiff was sent out to find people and bring them in as potential jurors, and of course he found people who were deeply prejudiced. It wasn't hard at the time, and I'm sure the bailiff rejected anybody who showed any sympathy.
4 men are going to be convicted and executed. 1 will commit suicide in prison, although the prosecution conceded that none of the defendants had thrown the bomb. The trial led to the eventual public hanging of 4 anarchists. Well, needless to say, the Haymarket incident was a source of outrage from people around the world. And in the following years, memory of the Haymarket martyrs was remembered with various May Day job actions and demonstrations. And in 1886, with the idea having spread around the world, the choice of May 1st became a commemoration by the Socialist Second International for the people involved in the 1886 Haymarket Affair. May 1st became an international day of solidarity amongst workers throughout the world as they learned about the Haymarket Affair. Let's conclude this section, or this part 3, with the documentary.
That mere fact that they were even being tried at all when the bomb thrower wasn't known is just a travesty. How can you even prosecute somebody for conspiracy if you don't have any evidence that they were together with the person that threw the bomb or that committed the crime?
Only 2 of the anarchists were at the scene, and they were both on the so-called podium in full public view. Somebody threw that bomb, but nobody had any idea who threw it.
Anarchy is on trial, the prosecutor said. Gentlemen of the jury, convict these men, make examples of them. Hang them, and you save our society. The verdict was guilty. The sentence, death by hanging. 3 asked for clemency and got life in prison. 1 blew himself up in jail with a cigar bomb. A former Tribune editor, Henry Demarest Lloyd, began a national campaign for clemency. Illinois' governor said he would support it if the businessmen did. Banker Lyman Gage gathered 50 of the business elite to argue that clemency would improve labor relations. He seemed to sway them. But they feared to cross Marshall Field, Chicago's most influential businessman, who was opposed.
The great industrialists all, I think, woke up, at least at times in the middle of the night in a cold sweat and worried about revolution. It was impossible not to entertain the potential for serious social unrest and indeed political and economic revolution in this country when the rewards of this extraordinary moment of change in capitalism were being so unequally distributed. And they knew it. Field knew it. Pullman knew it. Swift knew it. Armour knew it. They couldn't not know it. And that was a very scary possibility for people like Field.
You have to remember that this is a period of time that was still in the shadow of the Civil War. And people felt that if you didn't take a hard and firm line, as had been taken by Lincoln and the Republican Party against the slaveholders, if you didn't take a hard and firm line against threats to property, that this sort of thing would be repeated. And I can't help but think that Marshall Field felt that this was a great test of leadership.
You couldn't have invented an enemy that is more maniacal and more threatening to Field than the anarchist movement. Field thought, property is sacrosanct. I formed this business on my own. I worked up from stock boy. It's mine. They have no right to tell me how to run it, and certainly they're not going to tell me that they're going to dynamite it to death. Field and the elite control the banks and they control the business establishment. They've lost control of politics. Now are they going to lose control of their own businesses?
It caused a furor throughout the world. People saying, don't hang these guys, commute the sentence. And letters came from George Bernard Shaw from Tolstoy, I believe. Do not execute them. But there was one industrialist who was adamant, and that was Marshall Field I, the merchant prince. He said, in effect, hang the bastards.
As Chicago's capitalists tried to put their labor problems behind them, a memorial to the anarchists became a shrine for revolutionaries. The elite's attempt to project an image of urban harmony to the world would not be easy.